You read the title right. I'm actually doing this. Hello everybody and welcome to my YouTube channel, Sid Says. It's called that because I'm Sid and I'm saying things to you. Welcome to what will undoubtedly be the longest series in my channel. It might even become the longest series on YouTube or of any media ever because I am going to be consuming every piece of Dracula media ever created. And when I say every piece, I mean every piece. I'm not just doing movies and TV shows. I'm doing books, I'm doing stage plays, I'm doing musicals, operas, ballet, radio show, podcast, poems, video game songs, porn, and any other type of consumable media you can think of. I'm doing it all. But I am going to be skipping any Dracula media that I already covered in my Evolution of Dracula video, unless I have any new introspection I want to add. So if you really want to hear me talk about the original Dracula media, go ahead and watch the first video. Then come back here. Please come back here. Please. For the most part, I'm going to try to go in chronological order, but when it comes to things like songs and poems, I find that it's really hard to find the chronological ordered list for these. They usually are sorted by most popular, so that's probably how I'll make my way through those kinds of art forms. So with that out of the way, let's get started, because this is going to take me years, possibly the rest of my life, to get through. So let's hop in. First up, we have Mocked Micrana. So sorry for butchering that, or in English, Powers of Darkness, the Icelandic translation of the original Dracula novel, first serialized in the 1900 Reykjavik newspaper Fylkonen. Once again, apologies. Now, you're probably wondering why I've included this one when it's just a translated version of the original novel, and the reason for that is because it's not. In fact, the rabbit hole goes much deeper than you would think. After its original publication, Powers of Darkness was rediscovered and republished in 1986 for Icelandic audiences. But it wasn't until January of 2014 that a Dracula researcher named Hans de Roos realized that Powers of Darkness wasn't just an Icelandic translation of Dracula, but almost a completely different story with certain characters omitted, new characters added, and plot elements changed, etc. And in 2017, de Roos re-released Powers of Darkness as a full English translation for wider audiences to receive it. After this, a Swedish fiction expert, Rickard Berghorn, reached out to de Roos and told him about the Swedish translation of Dracula, Mörkretsmakter. Sorry. There, de Roos discovered that Powers of Darkness wasn't just a fanfic of Dracula, but it was a fanfic of Dracula, because Powers of Darkness was just an abridged version of Mörkretsmakter. I'm gonna stop trying to say that now. So, Swedish Dracula was first published as a serial in the Stockholm newspaper Dagen in 1898, only 2 years after Dracula was published, and it's almost twice as long as the original novel. It also includes original illustrations from the newspaper, making it the first Dracula publication to include drawings after the 1898 Hungarian cover illustration, but more on that later. De Roos published the translated version of the Swedish Dracula as Powers of Darkness, the lost version of Dracula, in 2017. And in 2025, I bought and read it. And it was only published digitally, so I don't have a hard copy to dramatically hold up. Sorry. So with that long preface out of the way, it's time to finally talk about the Powers of Darkness, the Swedish version. Except it's not time yet, because first we've got to hear from this video's sponsor. Me. That's right, me. Because who else is crazy enough to try to consume every piece of Dracula media ever created? And I heard if you subscribe to my channel, you can get tag teamed by both Swedish and Icelandic Dracula. So if you want to get raw dog I can't say this on YouTube. What am I doing? So if you want to enter a consensual polyamorous relationship with two different but similar Draculas, please give me a like and subscribe, and go check out my various social medias linked in the description below. Thank you! And back to the video. The novel starts with a preface by de Roos about his discovery of this variant of Dracula and his attempt to find who wrote it. And I say attempt because we still don't know. There are a few good theories, but it's likely we'll never know for certain who wrote this Dracula fanfic. And don't come for me for calling it a fanfic, because even de Roos calls it that. And there's so much that's been added that it's almost entirely a different story. So let's talk about it. The novel starts the same way, with Jonathan going to visit Dracula to sell him a house in England, but in this version, Jonathan is named Thomas and Dracula is called Draculitz. How Swedish of him. For the most part, things remain the same, just with added details and longer descriptions of things. The real changes happen when Thomas meets one of Draculitz's relatives. That's right, he has relatives in this version. She's this beautiful woman who seems to have some sort of sexual power over Thomas, and he describes his attraction to her in great detail. This version of Dracula is significantly more horny than the original. And surprise! It's also way more racist. I was genuinely shocked by some of the shit I was reading in this book. Once again, I felt the strange sensation of fear and disgust, which one feels in the vicinity of a dangerous animal. It became increasingly clear to me that he was immoral and barbaric, the unreliable and despotic Oriental, or rather the half-Asian, whose virtues and vices, a legacy of ancient, unknown, and strangely mixed races, are near incomprehensible. And shall we not forget, I saw again a glimpse of the expression detested in his strange Asian eyes. Like, what? But anyway, while Thomas is lusting after this woman, Draculitz also comments on how beautiful she is, and Thomas is disgusted by how lustful he sounds and says it must be because of his primitive nature, when Thomas is out here thinking lustful thoughts of her 24/7. And yeah, it is way more weird because Draculitz is ambiguously related to this woman he's calling sexy, but Thomas makes it about his race rather than just thinking it's Draculitz in particular who's a fucking freak. And there are way more examples of this that are baked into the new plot elements. Like, Thomas discovers that some of Draculitz's relatives look very ape-like, and this is more proof of them being subhuman. And in this version, Draculitz runs an international cult where they sacrifice young women and plan to topple all of Western civilization. So... Anyway, from there, Thomas is abandoned to the mercy of the vampire woman in Draculitz's castle, and we move on to part 2. Here we switch perspectives to Mina Murray and Lucy Westenra, who have been renamed Wilma Murray and Lucy Western. Things play out relatively similar to Dracula, but just like Thomas's section, it's a lot more drawn out with more details. And at first I found these added elements annoying and extraneous, but after you get used to them, I feel like they actually do a much better job of building tension and making you feel a greater sense of dread than you did in the original novel. Another small change I enjoyed is Wilma mentioning how she wants to become a reporter someday. It gives an explanation as to why she talks in such a flowery way, and it also adds more depth to her character, which I enjoy. The Demeter shipwreck is also described in this section of the book and is mostly the same as Dracula, but the difference that really tickled me is that instead of taking the form of a large black wolf and jumping off the ship, Draculitz instead takes the form of a large yellowish dog, and when the people of Whitby see the dog, they want to adopt him and make him the city dog, and I love the idea of Draculitz being heralded as the town good boy against his will. And I didn't mention this before, but there are a lot more graphic depictions of violence in this book. There are multiple women whose deaths and murders are described in Thomas's section, and in this section, Draculitz kills a dog and, eviscerates him. It's nothing too shocking by today's standards, but just like the added sexiness, it's a little unexpected to see it in a book from a much more conservative time. We're also introduced to Dr. Seward, who runs an insane asylum, and Arthur Homewood, who later becomes Lucy's fiancé during this section. Wilma and Lucy also actually meet Draculitz in this version, although he's posing as an Austrian baron. It's also implied that a few Romani people followed Draculitz here from Romania, and they are of course described horribly as these little dirty, smarmy people, and are only ever referred to by using slurs, so that's just another example of this book's amplified racism compared to the original. They're also shown to have magical powers and are maybe even vampires too, or at least some of them are. Lucy and Wilma go to visit them, and a fortune teller woman shows Lucy a vision of her fiancé Arthur supposedly cheating on her with another woman, but we later learn that this woman is actually Mary, his sister, and one of the added characters in this book. Mary is married to a Romanian nobleman but has since left him and is trying to obtain a divorce since he has become abusive. This information will come back later, so hold on to it. Anyway, just like the original, Lucy is sleepwalking and growing anemic, and Wilma is taking care of her, but while she's doing this, Wilma is also talking with Thomas's boss, Mr. Hawkins, about Thomas's disappearance, and then we're introduced to yet another new character, Edward Tellett, a private investigator hired by Mr. Hawkins to investigate where Thomas went. Wilma eventually leaves Whitby to join the investigation, and Lucy moves back to her estate in Hillingham now that the summer's over, and to get prepared for her wedding. Speaking of which, there are added descriptions from Lucy's diary about her getting her dress designed and her jewelry fitted for her wedding that just add this extra layer of sadness when you know what's going to happen to her. So anyway, Lucy gets worse, and about 300 pages into this damn book is when Van Helsing finally shows up. Things play out the same with Lucy's treatment and death, but they draw out her death a little bit more in this version and kill off her maid. And even though the maid was killed by having her throat ripped out and it's all horrific and shit, I couldn't help but laugh during this sequence of events because number one, when Seward first shows up to Lucy's house but can't get in, he asks the gardener what's happening, and the guy just immediately just starts screaming that everyone must be dead with zero evidence. And number two, rip to the maid, but they absolutely roast her even though she's been freshly murdered. Also, Arthur kind of goes a little bit insane thinking Lucy's still alive and makes Seward go check on her tomb every day just to confirm she's still dead. Everything with Seward and Renfield's storyline has been basically the same, by the way, which is why I'm just skipping over it. And then we get descriptions of children starting to go missing and being found with bites on their necks, but in this version, a couple of the kids actually die. Anyway, the end of this section is Van Helsing ominously telling Seward that something really weird is going on. Woo! Side note, but it always bothered me how long it takes Van Helsing to explain to anyone what's really happening. Like, I get that they probably wouldn't believe him, but at least he could say that he tried and maybe even saved Lucy's life in the process, but I digress. It's fine. I'm over it. So I found part 3 to be very irksome. There were a lot of extraneous details that didn't add anything or build tension. In my opinion, it was just a lot of the characters talking in circles for what felt like the sake of drawing out the story. And I think that this is in large part due to it being the most original content written for this adaptation so far. So we jump back to Wilma, who has been joined by Detective Tellett to investigate Thomas's disappearance, and they just straight up hate each other at first because Detective Tellett thinks that Thomas is a scoundrel who's been doing a bunch of shady shit, and Wilma thinks Detective Tellett is an asshole for thinking this. But she soon realizes why he thinks this because she sees a Romani man who resembles Thomas to a scary degree. Though the way she describes it is casually racist. But anyway, we learn earlier in the story that this Romani man was working with Dracula's to intentionally throw off investigators' trail to make it look like Thomas was still out and about, but he must be done using him now because the next day, the Romani man is found dead with his throat ripped out. Wilma is brought to identify the body and is adamant that it isn't Thomas. Because she's so sure that it isn't him, Detective Tellett decides they should go to Dracula's castle since that was the last place Thomas was for sure at. They're joined by Mr. Hawkins and another detective he brought with him, Barrington Jones, whose name I kept accidentally reading as Busterford Jones. But anyway, they all go to the castle, and while the boys are trying to figure out a way in, Wilma finds an entrance that she decides to explore alone, and she's attacked by one of Dracula's ape relatives and thrown to the ground where she breaks her foot. The men decide to take her to a nearby nunnery that provides medical care, and they leave her there to do some more investigating. Over the next few weeks while she's recovering, Wilma discovers that there's another English resident at the hospital, but since they're on different floors, they can't speak to each other and have to communicate through notes. The man says he cannot remember who he is, but spoiler alert, it's Thomas. When they're finally able to reunite in person, Thomas remembers everything except for all the shit that went down at the castle. Wilma and Thomas get married and everyone goes back to England where Wilma finds out that Lucy is dead, rip, and then Mr. Hawkins dies, double rip. 5 big booms for Lucy and Mr. Hawkins. Boom! 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 Anyway, Van Helsing shows up and Wilma gives him new info about what happened with Lucy, but she also shows him all the shit that Thomas wrote down in his notebook about Dracula's and his castle and his cult. Oh yeah, also earlier Thomas had a freak out when he saw Dracula's out in the city talking to a mysterious woman. More on her later. So Thomas does remember everything now, and Van Helsing finally spills the vampire beans and asks Wilma and Thomas to help kill Dracula. So now we jump to Dr. Seward, and holy hell, I hated this section. This was the most circular talking. It was so tedious. But anyway, Dr. Seward gets visited by Detective Busterford Jones, and he asks Seward about Carfax Abbey because it's right next to his madhouse, and Dracula is known to have bought the place, but Seward doesn't really know anything about it. that is, until a guy shows up and is like, I'm a servant at Carfax Abbey and we need you to come over because the lady of the house is really sick. So Seward goes over there and Draculitz doesn't live there, but the mysterious fancy lady we saw with him does. And this woman is also heavily implied to be the fortune teller from the Romani camp, but for now she claims to be a countess that says she needs to be hypnotized to be put to sleep and that Seward needs to come back every night to do this. While Seward is there, he also meets the Countess's brother, Prince Elamar, who is polite but weird. You should also remember him for later. So Seward keeps going every night to the Countess's place, and he keeps feeling weaker every time he goes. I wonder what's happening. But one night, while he's there, the Countess is throwing a party, and she performs a hypnosis trick that makes Seward feel really weird. And at the party, Seward meets a man with dwarfism named Signor Leonardi, who is a world-famous violinist, and he invites Seward to his concert tomorrow night. The next day, Seward goes to visit Mary and Arthur because Arthur has become very sick and is convinced that Lucy is still alive. Mary is also convinced that Lucy is alive because she saw her sucking up on Arthur's neck. Mary's heard about vampires before since her ex-husband is Romanian and tells Seward that's what she thinks is happening, but he convinces himself not to believe this, even though he wants to with all the shit he's been going through, with all the hypnotism and a bunch of people being found dead of blood loss with 2 holes in their necks. Later that night, Seward goes to Leonardi's concert and is supernaturally moved to tears by his performance. He sees a bunch of people from the party there too who talk about a new world order and how their plan is working out great. Seward also thinks he sees Lucy there, but once again convinces himself he must be wrong. The next day, Leonardi shows up at the madhouse and talks about his New World Order some more and asks if he can play his violin for the patients, but Seward declines. Seward visits the Countess again that night, and this time she outright drinks his blood from his neck while seducing him. Seward also just sits around as the cult performs this weird chant and ritual where they cut themselves, and after they're done, Prince Elamar is just like, "Wanna play some Parcheesi?" Anyway, Leonardi is there too and manages to strong-arm Stewart into letting him play the violin for his patients. I'm sure nothing will go wrong there. We are mercifully at the last section of the book and back to Thomas's perspective. Van Helsing shows up at his and Wilma's house with Detective Jones, Detective Tellett, and Quincy Morris, who has decided to rejoin the story. And I don't even think I've mentioned him up until now because his presence has been so insignificant in this version. But he was basically only present during part 2 where he asked Lucy to marry him, got rejected, then gave her some blood, and he's been gone ever since. But anyway, they all team up and Van Helsing mentions that Seward should also be there, but he's gone MIA for a while, but none of them really seem too concerned by this, despite everything that's happening, and they move on. They compile their evidence together and discover that Draculitz and the Baron are the same person, shocker, and that he is the head of this international secret cult of vampires that wants to overthrow Western society, and have already successfully manipulated public opinions, created new morality, and have all the worst and basest instincts on their side, an unscrupulous lust for profit, and an indifference to the rights of others, which really forms the bedrock of society. So yeah, don't forget to sprinkle a little racism in there for flavor. Anyway, after they discuss all this, Quincy is like, can we go back to the part where Seward is missing? And everyone is like, oh yeah, that's kind of important, isn't it? And Bustopher Jones is like, oh yeah, I know all about that. The entire hospital staff has been replaced, and people can be seen swapping back and forth between the asylum and Carfax every night. Locals think the place is haunted now, and Seward hasn't been seen for weeks. Like, hello? And he didn't think to mention that? You didn't think that was important to mention until now? And he's like so casual about it too. He's like, these are just isolated observation and reports, which must be taken with a grain of salt. But in view of what we already know, they do give rise to some concern. And Van Helsing's like, some concern? Yeah. Still, everyone is like, maybe it's not that bad. Maybe Seward just went to go stay with Arthur since he's sick. So they send a telegram to see if Seward has been with Arthur and move on. They decide their next step is for Wilma and Thomas to rent a house near Carfax Abbey so they can spy on Draculitz. And the reasons they give is because Wilma and Thomas are the only two who actually know what he looks like, and because no one will be able to identify them. But that is just not true. Like, the first point, yes, great, they are the only two people left alive who have seen Draculitz in person, but Draculitz also knows what they look like, especially Thomas. Like, he could see him and go, oh shit, you're the guy I tried to murder. Looks like you're still alive. Guess I'll have to try to murder you again. But I guess they're just not concerned about that. Anyway, they get a telegram back from Mary who says she hasn't seen Seward in forever, and also Arthur is super not looking too hot. So Wilma and Thomas and the detectives head to London while Van Helsing and Quincy head to Hillingham to help Arthur. Everyone reconvenes in London where Van Helsing tells them that Quincy has checked himself into Seward's asylum as a patient to gather intel from the inside. This doesn't go great though, because only a few days later, Quincy shows up with a bad head injury, but good news, Seward is with him. But bad news, Seward is insane now. At the same time all of this is happening, they also get a telegram from Mary saying that Arthur has died from his illness. Rip Arthur, but they can't mourn him now because they need to take Quincy to the hospital. And on their way there, they find out that someone has been murdered at Seward's asylum, and also it's on fire. They decide there's no more time to waste and they need to kill Dracula immediately. Luckily, the detectives have managed to track down the estate he's hiding at, and they all rush over there before the sun goes down. Detective Tella also recruited 2 other guys whose wife and fiance had been killed by Dracula, but they don't matter at all. Anyway, Van Helsing passes out silver bullets to everyone and they go inside. They find Dracula's coffin with a Dracula inside, but before any of them can pull the trigger, the sun goes down and he wakes up. And just like I fucking said would happen, Dracula recognizes Thomas and immediately tries to kill him, and everyone is shooting their guns, but all the super bullets end up being completely useless because Van Helsing just ends up stabbing Dracula with a dagger, and Dracula dies and turns to dust. Thomas writes that in the months following Dracula's death, many of his followers disappeared, committed suicide, or were arrested. And for all the detail this author goes into for no reason, I wish they had described what being in prison is like for a vampire. Anyway, Seward succumbs to his insanity and dies of being insane, I guess. Van Helsing also gets consent from Arthur's sister Mary to put Lucy out of her misery, and they both go to the grave to stake her through the heart. They do the same thing to Arthur later that night. They also find out that the man murdered at Seward's asylum was Prince Elimar, and that Prince Elimar was, dun dun dun, Mary's ex-husband. Is this shocking? I really don't think so. We don't know anything about these characters. But it turns out Quincy killed him when he was escaping the asylum, and Renfield was the one who set the place on fire. Why? I don't know. Don't ask me about that. But yeah, everything is good now. Evil has been vanquished. The end. Overall, I would say I liked the parts of this book rather than its whole. But I do like whole, am I right, fellas? Aspects that I enjoyed are that the characters, for the most part, seem to have more in-depth characterization, and like I mentioned earlier, some of the more lengthy descriptions really help to build tension in a way that I didn't think was very present in the original novel. But more often than not, the added details felt superfluous and grating to get through. It truly felt like a middle schooler trying to reach the minimum page count, and the minimum page count was almost 700 pages long. The plot also felt a lot less cohesive and satisfying compared to Dracula. The first 2 parts of the novel are probably my favorite because they aren't too dissimilar from the original text. And it's not just that it's different that I don't like it, it's because the characters feel more spread out. The different stories don't feel like they come together. A majority of the characters never even interact with each other, unlike in Dracula where they all team up at the end. Also, while I did say I felt this version made the characters feel more deep, that's only true for a few of them. Characters like Quincy, Arthur, and Renfield felt really tossed to the side in order to make room for new characters that I liked a lot less. And Wilma, despite being such an important character, all but disappears from the story at the end. In addition, many of the added plot threads felt unfinished or hurriedly wrapped up, which is insane to me considering the monster girth of this novel. It's like how Disney is making 2.5-hour-long movies that still feel rushed and underdeveloped. There's no excuse for it. But despite its flaws and its insane amped up racism, can't forget about that, I would say The Swedish Powers of Darkness is still a good read, and it's very fascinating to read about and dissect the differences between it and the original novel. So I do still recommend you read this one, especially if you're a hardcore Dracula fan like I am. And with that, let's see if abridging this thick-ass book has any impact on the quality and read the Icelandic Powers of Darkness. While the Swedish version is almost 700 pages long, the Icelandic version is a brisk 268 pages. It's also only broken into 2 parts rather than 4. I already gave you the backstory for this one, so let's hop right into the plot. So the first thing I noticed in this abridged version is that it's pretty much identical to the Swedish version, but abridged. But there are a few other noticeable differences. I did notice that the Icelandic version so far seems to be less racist than the Swedish version, but still more racist than the original. The Count seemed to have noticed that I was a bit unnerved because his strange eastern eyes looked at me from beneath his brows. But if the Count has inherited some nasty tribal character from the Huns, such as an urge to kill or some other sinister trait, it is best to be cautious. I have become a captive, fearing for my life under the power of an oriental tyrant. So you see, still racist, but not as racist. Draculitz is back to being just Dracula, and Thomas is still Thomas, but he's Lutheran in this version when he was stated to be Protestant in both the Swedish and original novels. And I did look this up, and just as I suspected, this change was most likely made because Lutheranism is the most popular sect of Christianity in Iceland. Another change made is that all depictions of the Romani people have been replaced with a different group of people known as the Tatars, a catch-all name given to Turkic-speaking people who live in Asia and Slavic countries. However, they are still described in the same ways despite these differences, which doesn't make sense because as far as I can tell, Tatars aren't nomadic people like the Romani are, and in fact are very different from them in basically every way, like language, religion, appearance, ethnic background, culture, like everything. And I tried to look up the reason for this change too, but as far as I can tell, there aren't any Tatars in Iceland, or at least not a big enough population to be worth recording in their demographics. My best guess for this change is that the Tatars would have been a more recognizable minority group for Icelandic audiences compared to the Romani, because even if Tatars weren't in this country, they were still well known throughout Slavic and Baltic countries like Iceland. Whew, now that we're done with our little history lesson, let's move on to the rest of the novel. So first change right off the bat is we suddenly switch to third-person narration, which has never happened in any Dracula book that I've read so far. The closest we've ever gotten to a third-person narrative before this is when we're presented with newspaper articles or reports. I originally thought this change was made to make abridging the story easier so we can skip all the exposition and get to the action, but that was not the case. I kept waiting for the summarizing to stop and for the journal entries and letters to come back, but they never did. The entire second half of the book, aka the majority of the novel, is written like a Sparks Note summary. It's insane. And while we're speedrunning through this story, the author also chose to spoil multiple super important plot points before they actually happen. You know, just little stuff like Lucy's illness and death, the reveal that Thomas is still alive, and the fact that they fucking kill Dracula. All of that spoiled before it happens. Wild choices all around. You know, I was worried how they were going to pull off abridging the whole Swedish novel when Thomas's section in part 1 takes up more than half of the page count, but I didn't think they'd stoop to Wikipedia plot synopsis levels. I mean, what can I say? I finished this book in less than 2 hours. I was left feeling disappointed. You know, you read all this backstory and build up about all this lost fanfic of a fanfic of Dracula, and it turns out the fanfic fucking sucks. And Renfield's just gone. They nuked his character. He's gone. As tedious as it was reading the Swedish version, at least the Swedes actually gave me something to read. At least they gave me an actual fucking story. I think the most baffling decision is that they actually presented Thomas's notes in part 1, then decided to go full Sparks notes for part 2. Like, I don't think I would have been this mad about it if they had just gone full book report with it and just summarized everything. They gave me false hope, and that's what I'm really pissed about. After all the grief I went through reading the Swedish version, I still prefer that one to this one. I wouldn't even recommend you read this one. You can get just as much substance from reading the Wikipedia article. I will say, though, that the introduction at the beginning and the references at the end are worth reading if you're interested in history because they provide a lot of fascinating details collected by Hans de Roos and other historians. There's even a foreword written by Dacre Stoker, the great-grandnephew of Bram Stoker, which is super cool. There's also an entire section dedicated to mapping out what Dracula's castle looks like based on Thomas's descriptions. It's all super awesome, and it's the only parts of the book I liked. Woo! We're finally circling back around to this. Remember when I mentioned drawings at the beginning of this video? No? Well, now you do. The first ever known artwork for Dracula was created in 1819 with the publication of the Hungarian translation of the novel Dracula with a K. And yes, this is an actual translation this time, not a fanfic or a fanfic of a fanfic pretending to be a translation. The only artwork was for the book cover, and cool fact, the Hungarian translation is the first known translation of Dracula, first published in a Hungarian newspaper on January 1st, 1898. In all my research, the only person I've ever found talking about this artwork is Hans de Roos, and even he does not mention who the artist is, so I can only unfortunately assume that this information has been lost to time. But what I do know is that Professor Gino Farkas from the University of Eötvös-Loránd in Budapest, sorry for butchering that, has a theory for how Dracula ended up in Hungary. He theorizes that the Hungarian translator and newspaper publisher, who is also named Gino, by the way, kind of a fun coincidence, must have seen Dracula during a Christmas book fair in London, and it probably caught his eye because it had a yellow cover, which at the time was only used for books containing scandalous or erotic material. This theory is backed up because Gino Riccozzi actually published an article in December of 1897 claiming that Dracula was the sensation of the Christmas book market in London. However, Farkas also refutes his own theory by mentioning that Riccozzi also claimed that Dracula was the sensation of the American book market, even though Dracula hadn't been released in the US yet. And he also kept calling Stoker an American author, so Riccozzi clearly is an unreliable source who doesn't know what the hell he's talking about. But regardless of how Dracula ended up in Hungary, we do know that it did, and that this book cover is the first time Dracula has ever been depicted in artwork that we know of. The oldest artwork of Dracula and the first ever fully illustrated version of Dracula is the Swedish Powers of Darkness, which you may be familiar with by now. Like I mentioned earlier, we don't know for sure who wrote the Swedish Dracula, but there are some good theories. De Roos's prime suspect is the newspaper editor Andres Albert, but there's no smoking gun. You can't prove anything, Hans. But because we don't even know who wrote the dang thing, we also don't know who drew any of the images. None of them were signed, and de Roos even reached out to a Swedish newspaper illustrator historian, but even she couldn't identify the art style. So as of now, the artist is unknown, but their art is not. The full text contains 153 drawings, although some versions have been found that only contain 50 or even as little as 43 illustrations, or illustrations that have been altered. De Roos speculates that this may have been done as a form of censoring because some of the images depict graphic violence or nudity, some of which is so explicit that I have to censor it for YouTube, so not much has changed, has it? And Hans de Roos has carefully compiled all the illustrations into this book. Oh yeah, I have it. The quality of the images has been restored and colored by Hans himself, and I just want to say, very lovely man. That's right, I actually spoke with Hans over email to receive this book, and we unfortunately had to do a lot of back and forth about payment and shipping because we don't live in the same country, but I was so happy when I finally got it, and look. Can you see? It's even signed by Hans and Dacre Stoker. Hans even wrote me a little message on the inside. Thank you, Hans. But enough stalling, let's actually look at some of the drawings. Hans chose not to enhance and colorize all the drawings, but rather the ones he thought were most important or featured more than one character. If you want to look at all the drawings, you should buy the full Swedish translation. Right away, I noticed his color choices were very bold and not entirely accurate to what was described in the book. For example, Thomas is described as having dark hair, but Hans colored his hair yellow. He also put Thomas in a green suit and Draculitz in a purple one, despite Thomas being described as wearing gray and Draculitz being described as wearing all black. However, this is surely not due to lack of care or attention to detail. Hans clearly has a deep love and understanding of Dracula and all its variants. This was obviously an artistic choice he deliberately made to make the images more colorful and dynamic. That being said, I'm kind of a stickler for details, and I don't think the bright, vivid colors match with the dark aura of the story. As a fellow artist, they aren't how I personally would have colored them, but I still very much appreciate how lovingly they've been restored and documented for Dracula fans like me to enjoy. I would really recommend you buy this one if you have the means. It is a little difficult to achieve since you'll have to go to Hans's website and find his email and reach out to him personally if you want a copy, but I promise it'll have been well worth it. All right, and with that, this concludes part 1 of consuming every piece of Dracula media. Thanks for sticking around, and make sure you come back for part 2. As always, thank you so much for watching, and remember, if you subscribe, you can enter a consensual but highly confusing polyamorous relationship with 2 Nordic Draculas. But if you can't overcome the minor drawback of Swedish Dracula being super racist and Icelandic Dracula also being racist, but to a lesser degree, don't even worry about it. Bye!